All right, so welcome to our third and final panel discussing the future of migration policy in the EU. For our awareness campaign, It's Personal, Reframing the EU refugee crisis. Throughout our campaign, we tried to connect the dots between instability and migration. In the first panel, we covered the instability that prefaced the waves of migration that reached Europe in 2015. In our second panel, we learned about the reality of migrant experiences from our incredible panelists who had experienced a journey migrating to the EU that same year, in addition to the activism and experiences of migrants confined in camps today. Our main argument this whole campaign has been instability leads to migration. Even though it's been 5 years since the EU declared the migration crisis over, people have continued to flee dangerous conditions all over the world. In our view, the only crisis has been EU's response. Just this last January, the UN reported over 100,000 displaced by a resurgence of violence in Sudan's Darfur region. And at the same time, the Independent reported fresh concerns over the lack of healthcare for refugees in military camps. Data shows ambulance calls out made every 2 days at Napier barracks. So in this final panel, we'd like to focus on the future. Where do we go from here, both in terms of migration policy and refugee rights in the EU? So we have two incredible panelists joining us today. First, we have Matthias from Europe Must Act and Councillor Paymana of London, UK. I could read your guys' bios because we have amazingly put together your guys' awesome experience, but that's not any fun. So why don't we go ahead and start with introductions? Matthias, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I'm Matthias. I'm one of the co-founders of Europe Must Act, which is a movement that was founded in March 2020 by grassroots organizations and NGOs that are based on the Greek islands, where they provide assistance and support to asylum seekers residing in the hotspot camps. Our focus or our goals are to campaign or to move towards a humane migration policy. And one of the ways that we do this is by mobilizing people at a very local level, because we believe that the political gridlock, as we have it now in Europe, is very much taking place at the state level. And we believe that there's a lot of potential for change, for the better, at the local, at the municipal level. Thank you very much.
Awesome. All right, Paymana, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
So hi, my name's Paymana. I'm a local elected councillor in London. We, as a council, have lots of individuals who come to the UK and seek asylum and refuge. And so we have responsibility to house them and support them in London. And so that's one of our main jobs as councillors, to try and support our constituents. I've been working in the NGO sector for a very long time, so the charity sector, mainly on girls' rights and supporting marginalised communities across the globe, but also here at home in the UK. So I can talk a little bit more about that later, but that's just a bit of an introduction to who I am. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So I'll put Matthias with the first question. I don't know. Sorry. So Matthias, what compelled you to start assisting during the migration crisis? You know, you founded Europe Must Act. What kind of motivated that in you?
Yeah, I think the most important aspect here is the fact that for me, this is very much a European crisis, and I identify as European. I'm originally from Belgium. And I feel, yeah, this is, as you said, the real crisis is the political, is the EU not taking action and not developing effective and humane policies. And yeah, so I very much feel this is Europe's mess, and it is up to also European citizens to step up and take action, almost as a form of civil disobedience, because yeah, our politicians, our elected leaders are failing to do what they should do. And then there's another more personal aspect. So I have a background in education. I taught high school for many years. And I originally came to the Greek islands as an English teacher, providing English classes in non-formal education centers, because yeah, I realized that there was a need, because people were stuck here for long, indefinite periods of time, and that there was a huge need for education. Lots of young people. That were really children, young people that were really in need of education, whose right to education was basically not ensured. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
That's amazing. Yeah, I feel like the purpose that catapults us into our work is always such a beautiful mix of the world and what's personal. But that's a side note. Paymana, in the same sense, at the time you were working to become a political member in the UK during the migration crisis of 2015 through 2018, did you ever anticipate that we'd still be here, or we'd still be continuing where we are now?
I think it's interesting that Matthias said, you know, this is a European problem. It's so interesting because in the United Kingdom, a lot of British people don't really see it as a British problem, something that we should think about, because we are an island and therefore we are away from the mainland European issues of the influx of refugees coming in. And so, no, did I anticipate that this would be going on until now? No. But I think what we saw in 2015 was this influx of refugees into mainland Europe through Greece, from Turkey into Greece. And I think a lot of people didn't expect that to continue. I think the instability across the world in terms of conflict, in terms of climate change, people thought that these would be reduced and maybe the situation would change, especially with harsher policies in Europe, with rejecting refugees and migrants and stopping them from coming through to other European countries, that this would stop the influx of refugees coming. But what we've noticed and what we've realized, that people will still risk their lives, you know, going onto those dinghy boats and crossing and drowning in the sea to get to relative safety, because they have no other option. And so, no, it's not surprising, but I thought that maybe our political leadership at the top, whether that's at the European level or the British government level, we would have tackled this in a different way. And I think that maybe one of the biggest things is the shift in the way that people have thought about the refugee crisis. The fact that we are even calling it a crisis, it's a humanitarian issue, right? It's about people's lives. This is not a crisis in that kind of sense. This is about humanity, and we haven't been able to tackle it in the right sense. So is it surprising? No, but I expected better from our political leaders, and especially our policies. The fact that Europe is one of the richest regions in the world, and so we should have been able to support this influx of refugees coming here.
All right, well, that was pretty much the perfect segue, because my next question for you, Matthias, is, in your view, what's the significance of the word crisis as it relates to the migration policy, or as it relates to migration policy?
Yeah, I think working in the field, because I'm currently based on the Greek island of Chios, and I've been in Greece for the past year and a half. I very much agree with Paymana that this is a humanitarian crisis, and worst of all, it's a human-made humanitarian crisis. This is not a natural disaster or something. This is not something that is unavoidable or just part of life. This is something that is a consequence of flawed policies. And this is the reason why for the past 5-6 years, there has been protracted humanitarian crisis here in the Aegean. And yeah, it's still very much, if you look at mainstream media, it's still very much framed as a migration crisis, a refugee crisis. Which is frustrating because it does hide a lot of the reality of what is actually happening on the ground. And I think one more very important point to add to the whole sense of crisis is that it creates the idea of this is an emergency, this is an unusual situation. So we are allowed to let go of the standard norms and laws. We can deviate from these. which means we can deviate from respecting human rights. We can tolerate human rights violations, and this is what we constantly see. We see pushbacks now at sea, people, the Greek Coast Guard, Frontex being involved in pushing people back to Turkey. We see human rights violations in the camps, in the Balkans. It's on a massive scale, and all of this is justified to the public as being an exceptional situation that requires exceptional measures. So this is why the concept of crisis here is very, very concerning.
Yeah. So I'm trying to find the best way to pick up on the pushbacks and connect it back to policy for viewers to sort of understand the way that that word crisis sort of manifests itself. It almost gives me, I don't want to say deja vu, but it reminds me of the ways that the US has used the word terrorism in their policy. And, you know, the very different situations, it allowed for them to use this word that kind of stood as a blanket concept, or, you know, evoked certain ideas in the public, and then allowed for them to move forward with their national security agenda as a result. So policy does matter. So I'm gonna go ahead and pose this question to Peymana. Just kind of vaguely, what role does policy play in this crisis? That was a horrible way to phrase it, but what role does policy play in the public perception of what has now been called a crisis?
I think that's a really good question, and it's very important in terms of actual policy and the way that it frames the narrative. I mean, if you look at the example of the United Kingdom, you know, the fact that detention centres were opened to try and move some of these refugees or migrants into these detention centres, that's a state policy of a holding cell, in essence, for people who have come here running away from conflict. In the UK, one of the policies, or how they've been able to, how the public has been able to see this, is through a hostile environment, basically creating very difficult situations where refugees and asylum seekers or undocumented individuals cannot access any social security provided by the state. And so in the United Kingdom, there is something called no recourse to public funds status. Those are individuals whose refugee or asylum seeking status is unknown, and therefore they are not allowed access to any state social security. That means they cannot get any help through housing, or any help on buying food, or being able to have a job. And so that literally puts people at a destitute situation. And so policies are very, very important because they impact people on the ground, and then they create this perception of refugees in the national public eye, of public opinion. And so if you see refugees, for example, who are undocumented, who are looking for cash in hand work, that creates a different type of perception in communities. And so policies have a real life on the ground impact on refugees, but also the wider community in general.
That's really interesting. Last night, our collaboration team was talking about, you know, what's the relationship here? Is it that politicians and the rhetoric begets policy, or causes policy, or is it that the policy influences public perception? And, you know, we after like 20 minutes of what felt like philosophical debate, we ended up, you know, we'll leave it to the panelists, and actually even scratch the question, but you did kind of, you know, touch on it for us. And in your view then, Peymana, how has the politicization of refugees affected British politics? You know, essentially the same question. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, you know, it's really difficult to say which one influences which one in terms of your question on policy versus public perception. But I think the biggest thing for the UK is the Brexit vote. I think that really brought out, so Brexit is when the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, the union of various different countries across Europe, to be part of a free movement deal. So people who live in the European Union can move freely between the different countries and work and live and study there. And it seems that this issue was a big issue for people in the UK, and so that became a political issue. The free movement of people was politicized by far-right political parties such as the UK Independence Party, whose notorious leader, Nigel Farage, during the European Union referendum in the United Kingdom, stood in front of a poster of refugees who were crossing into mainland Europe with the, literally, and I quote, "breaking point" words splashed onto the image. That didn't cause as much outrage as it should have. You know, the fact that there was a far-right individual from a far-right political party standing there and saying that we are at breaking point and therefore we are, you know, overcome with these individuals trying to enter the United Kingdom, that says a lot in terms of how that impacts the politics of the UK and the debate within politics in the UK. So I think that the vote for Brexit and the European Union really brought out these issues on a different level than previously. And I think that these individuals or these actors were able to utilize the feelings of people in communities in the United Kingdom, specifically relating to this free movement issue, because what we had was communities from Romania and Poland specifically coming into the UK to take up low-paid jobs. Jobs that people here in the United Kingdom wouldn't do for that amount because we have a national minimum wage and we have set wage criteria. So what we were seeing was wealthy individuals in the country undercutting labour and employing Eastern Europeans and therefore giving them cash in hand. And therefore that was creating resentment in a lot of communities. One of the other things that the Conservative government in the United Kingdom did was remove a fund that was set up by the previous Labour government that was supposed to help those communities that were overwhelmed with such migration or influx of other individuals from Europe. And this fund was supposed to help top up services such as schools, medical facilities and various other things. That fund was technically taken away by the Conservative government. And so what you saw was local authority councils not having the ability to being able to manage that influx of individuals in those specific smaller communities, or promote better community cohesion and relations between these different communities. So it's been a slow and gradual move towards demonization and the politicization of refugees in domestic UK politics and the issues of economics and the issues of jobs, education and all of the rest of it. And it seems to me that people in the United Kingdom, specifically far-right political parties, have found a scapegoat for many of the issues that are already underlined in the United Kingdom. These are issues that have been going on for decades, you know, poverty, inequality, racial discrimination. All of these issues have already been there, but it seems to me that the European Union referendum and the Brexit vote, these political parties were able to find refugees as the scapegoat or migrants as the scapegoat, people who already themselves had gone through so much or had just simply come here for a better life.
Wow, two things. One, you've been doing an excellent job with segueing us because we are about to move into right-wing populism and all of that. So thank you. And two, it's like I read about these things in the news, but hearing them from you, I don't even know how to explain how I feel, but it feels like life is a simulation. The things that happen in the States here in America, the ways that, for example, Trump's rhetorics surrounding people from South America and Mexico in particular, just demonizing a certain population for the sake of carrying out an agenda, better yet, you know. So it's interesting to hear. Okay, so Matthias, with the increased presence of the alt-right movements and fascist parties internationally, there's been an increased strain on the fight for humanitarian relief, especially where refugees and migrants are concerned, like Paimana just sort of helped us understand. Were there any indicators in your view of these movements gaining power in Europe, or has this recent migration flow uncovered a sudden, unforeseen rise in power?
I think the current right-wing populist parties and movements that we see nowadays, many of them go back far before 2015. I remember growing up in Belgium in the 90s, early 2000s. Far-right parties were also doing really well in the polls. So it definitely has its roots. I think in a way it's kind of, it's the it's the darker face of Europe. Europe was the source of the cradle of the Enlightenment, but there's also this counter movement, and that is still very much there, and that we're seeing more and more nowadays. And I think the events in 2015 and the humanitarian crisis that we talked about before, that we've seen here in the Aegean, but also across the Mediterranean, and also in the Canaries very recently, is a catalyst for right-wing movements. They really feed on this. To give you a very tangible example, exactly 1 year ago, there were very violent protests here on the Aegean Islands, and also at the Turkish-Greek border, in response to the fact that Erdogan had declared the border with Greece open for refugees, and that people were massing at the border and trying to cross, and this resulted in a lot of violent protests, actually right-wing movements from across Europe, from France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, they all flew in a couple of days. Just the whole region here was crawling with fascists. Like, there's no better name for them, for what they are. They're the real thing. They're fascists, to come here and fight, because they saw it as a struggle. They saw it as an invasion. And they really fed on this. There was a lot of disinformation at the time. Things were framed in such a way that it also, showing refugees as dangerous, as an invading force. There was a lot of talk about refugees being military-aged men, whatever that means. Then also what was the most shocking of all is seeing how the European Union itself, or representatives of the European Union, specifically Ursula von der Leyen, actually followed that narrative up to a certain degree. She went up to the Greek-Turkish border and declared that Greece is the shield of Europe, and that Europe stands with Greece. And using this framing of a shield, again, this violent rhetoric, we're talking about using terminology that implies violence, is just feeds the alt-right, feeds fascists, and this is very concerning. I hope that answered the question a bit, because I think I can go on and on about this. I'll just leave it here.
No, that was excellent. I hate to do this again and again and again, but it's amazing. It's not really amazing, but the parallels are quite insane. I mean, I think back to just the election we had recently in the US, and when Trump comes out and says, hey, this election's been fraudulent, over and over and over again. And while, again, like, conceptually, I'm talking about a completely different thing, right? But at the heart of it, it's reframing what's going on in such a way that resonates with the core of an ideological group, and sort of reinvigorates other feelings they have. And I mean, in our case, we saw the storm of the US Capitol, and they didn't just storm, they were there before, because in the same sense that, you had all the fascists come to the islands, we had every single white supremacist in the country make their way to DC. So it's really interesting the ways that public order influences action, and how that can otherwise have been different. If their leaders were preaching a different message. So really interesting. So Paimana, though you may not have experienced shifts in your own community, what can you say about your observations from public opinion in London or the UK at large when it comes to discussion of migrants?
I think this is a really important question, and obviously we can talk about this and try and digest it. It's quite a big chunk of something to digest, but I think the shift in my own community obviously was very much visible in London specifically after the referendum for leaving the European Union, and the fact that the UK voted to leave, but London voted to remain. And yet we still saw visible acts of increased hate crime and racism on the streets of London directly after that vote. And so that's an observation that we visibly were able to see. But I think the biggest thing for us to understand how shifts in public perception have moved away from being welcoming to refugees or being supportive of migrants is the fact that we had the attacks in New York in 9/11, and the fact that the war on terror saw interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and then the failed policies in Syria, and that influx of refugees from those conflicts, and the fact that Europe saw such an influx of individuals coming. And so you saw a change in what communities actually looked like in the UK. So you had villages in the north of England who had minimal number of people of colour, you know, already on a normal day, regardless of an influx of migrants or refugees. And now you're seeing a huge number of individuals, not only from Eastern Europe, but from other places across the world coming there. And so when you see a change visibly within your own community, naturally you will see a change in public perception of on a national stage. And so I think we can't talk about shifts in public opinion without talking about the wider context of global situations or global wars and things that have happened. I think the biggest thing, though, that I've observed is this moving away of compassion. Compassion from our public debate, and seeing these individuals as human beings that are running away from conflicts when you're talking about refugees. But even migrants, the fact that we're having to distinguish between refugee and migrant, you know, and moving away from talking about people being refugees to talking about them as being migrants is kind of dehumanizing them, making them sound like they're just running away from a perfectly lovely country and trying to come to the UK to try and grab other people's jobs or, you know, take housing away from individuals living here. No, that's not the case. The issue is that we've got poverty on a wide scale across the whole world, right? Poverty is the biggest issue. And so if you can't find a job, you know, young people graduating from universities, whether that be anywhere in the world, not being able to find a job and seeing on the internet. So the internet and social media has made us closer, understanding what's going on in different countries. Of course, naturally, a young man in the African continent or in Asia will be like, well, why should I sit here in my conflict-ridden nation without any opportunities for an actual good life when I could actually travel to Europe and try and make it, you know, and try and get out of this? And so that idea is completely detached from the public opinion or the thought of people when they think about migrants and refugees. And so we've moved away from looking at people on an individual level as humans of trying to make a better life, and looking at them as a collective of this, you know, as Matthias described, you know, this invading force that are about to come over here. And, you know, in some of the terminology that politicians in the United Kingdom used was that this could be a terrorist threat to the United Kingdom or to Europe, you know, seeing young men, especially minors, as adult males, and having a discussion in public, in the media in the United Kingdom about us looking at their dental records to find out their age because people did not believe that they were under the age of 18. You know, these are the kinds of shifts that we've seen in the public debate, not only on a national scale, but also on a local scale. I have to say, though, that whilst we see all of this negative imagery on national television or debates through politicians, some of our communities have actually pulled together. And so we have to also acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge the fact that Europeans have come out individually. Well, forget our governments. Let's talk about our people, because our people have actually come out individually, donated to charities, volunteered in charities to help refugees, opened up their homes in some cases, you know, and let refugees stay with them. So there's a lot of compassion and love from the people of Europe regardless of what we see at the top of our politicians or our media. And so I have to say, a couple of years ago, I was able to host a group of young Afghan girls from Afghanistan who played in the only female orchestra who came to the UK. And I hosted them in Harrow, in the London Borough of Harrow, and we held them a concert. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted to shift perceptions in my community of what the reality is for people in countries that are impacted by conflict. And the biggest thing that stayed with me from that is when we hosted the Q&A session with the girls. And there was a white working class man from my community in Harrow who stood up, and after hearing everything that was said, he said, hats off to your bravery. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing, and welcome to Harrow, and that to me just spoke volumes, because I know that if people on the ground in our communities across Europe actually listen to the stories and the actual human impact of the life on these individuals, there's going to be way more compassion than we see at the top. And I think that we shouldn't forget that.
That's so beautiful and really speaks to me. So I'm a first generation Iranian American, and my dad always tells me about his first 20 years. So he moved or migrated to the States in early 70s before the Iranian Revolution. And for him, it was really economic reasons at a time when an Iranian could get on a plane and just come to America. So it's a very separate situation, but he was also living in the Midwest during the Iranian hostage crisis, when public perception towards Iranians was not exactly hot. So, but the way that he describes it was, while he did have to actually lie about who he was and his identity in certain spaces, that didn't change that there was an American family who had found him and heard about him at church, who was giving him a home and a roof over his head because he couldn't get a job, because he couldn't go out and say, I'm Iranian. And so, yeah, there is the situation, or public perceptions, political societies are loaded. They're complex. And I feel like one of the core principles that we're, touching on today is that it's not necessarily the people in the leadership. It's the leaders who we ought to be pointing out and saying, hey, look at all the love and compassion within your societies. Why is that lost through your policies? Where is that lost? Where is the disconnect? But speaking on behalf of just like background, so me being Iranian American did have a lot to do with, us being on this call in the first place. So I have a lot of passion for my mom's experience, my grandma's experience, my aunt's experience, and so forth. And hence the title of this campaign being It's Personal. Paymana, I'm curious, has your Afghan background contributed to either, you could say, like your proximity to understanding the human aspects of these issues, or just empathizing and just being able to conduct, catapult you into your work?
Yes, of course, the answer to that is yes. Growing up in a refugee family in the UK, and watching my parents struggle, through the system, and the fact that my parents' qualifications weren't even accepted in the UK, so they had to literally start from scratch, taking English classes and starting their life from really zero, and coming here not speaking the language and trying to get integrated into the culture. But I think the biggest thing for me is not just through my activism or my elected role, but just watching what's happening in my community. The fact that we have a conservative government that came into power in 2010 and has initiated policies that do not support or help anybody that is working class, regardless of what race they are or religion they are. They've demonized, obviously, a specific set of people who are refugees, but seeing that deprivation and the attacks on my community is what encouraged me to get involved in politics, actually. But being able to empathize or have compassion for refugees and migrants, I think that is literally a human thing. There is a very famous poem that's engraved on the doors of the United Nations. It's a Farsi poem, so you might be familiar with it, Sarah. It's called Bani Adam. It talks about how if you have if you see someone who's inflicted with pain, who's another human being, how can you not feel their pain? You know, as a human being, you should be able to have compassion for a person who's hurting. And so being able to see that hurt in your community should be able to make you sympathize and have compassion. Obviously, for me, in the personal context, I have had my own experiences growing up, you know, and being seen as an other or an outsider in my own community. I came to the UK when I was 3, and so I don't know any other country the way that I know the United Kingdom. However, there are people here who don't see me as British even at times, you know, but it's not about allowing other people to define you. It's about finding your own space. And so, of course, my experiences and watching my family and those of my uncles and my aunts has allowed me to feel differently about refugees and sympathize with them. But we also have to understand that sometimes we have refugee communities in the United Kingdom. For example, let's take the Afghan community in the UK, and let's look at the Brexit referendum, right? The vote to leave the European Union. I met lots of people whilst campaigning to remain, who were from my background, who were also refugees, who came to this country as refugees, voting to leave the European on the sole issue of immigration, saying that we don't want Eastern Europeans to come here. And so what we see is competition between different migrant and refugee communities as well. And so I don't think that it's only about having compassion just because you are a refugee. I think it's more about seeing and being able to empathize with other people's pain.
Yeah, so something I'm really passionate about is, it's kind of a philosophical concept, but just the accidental property of existence. We're born somewhere. We don't have any say in where that place is. And the next thing is our human condition is survival. We're going to adapt and we're going to survive, and we're going to do things in order to ensure that survival. So how do we allow for humans to become more empathetic to the things that we have to do to ensure survival, which sometimes is migration, which sometimes is getting up and leaving everything we have and know, not because we want to. You know, my dad or my mom is a much better, in my view, example. She didn't want to leave her career in Iran to start completely over in a place where she had to be a nanny and start from square one again. So I'm curious, I want to try to bring Matthias into this. From a European perspective, how do we, I don't know, I guess I could state this one of 2 ways. I'm going to do it this way. How do you believe we can address sort of xenophobia or just this demonization we've been talking about that's directed towards refugees on a community level?
Yeah, I think maybe first I want to get back to the idea of compassion, because I disagree that human beings are just about survival. I think what has been at the core of the human species being so successful is compassion. Is that we understand each other, that we work together, that we feel for each other. And what I see is, and I really believe that compassion is the default mode of human beings. When we see someone in pain, we feel their pain. But the public narratives that we see, I often, I regard them as excuses. People trying to find excuses why they should not feel compassion for this one person because, ooh, be careful, it's a Muslim, so shouldn't feel too much compassion for them. Because remember, so it's all kinds of excuses that people are looking for. And there are all kinds of arguments for this. And so people just kind of go around shop and find an argument to demonize a group and say, okay, I don't have to feel compassion for that. And but to go back to like the idea of compassion as the default mode of human beings, I think this is also the reason why there's so much potential at local level to change things. Because also, for example, the example that Peymana gave about the concert and then white middle-class man actually being moved by this and expressing this compassion. I think these contacts that can be made or communities that can be created at local level, where you can, I think they can be much more powerful than whatever's coming through the media, whatever's on the social media feed. and I think they can really pierce through like these real life contacts, this proximity. I think they can really pierce through these narratives, through these excuses, and help people to capture that compassion again. And that's also one of the main reasons why, yeah, with Europe Must Act, we are so focused on local mobilization and setting up city chapters and getting people involved locally, building up networks, and also addressing their council and calling on their city councils to adopt policies or put pressure on the national level to adopt policies that are more welcoming, that are more, that create opportunities in local communities, that support local communities to also be more inclusive. So I see there's so much potential for compassion and for change at the local level. Yeah, thank you.
I always smile whenever people say so much potential, because you know we're full potential. I'm kidding, but I had to. But so you know I have to touch back, because to clarify, I didn't mean that humans are solely survival machines. The way I see it, we're human animals. I think the animal part of us is our condition. We're born into this world that way. Well, we're human animals. We're born into the world both ways, but the animal parts are default mode. It's what, you know, turns on and allows us to breathe, tells us we want water, pushes us to keep going. That's met with our humanity. And within our humanity, I think, yes, there is compassion, but also there's the ability for that compassion to be manipulated, because we're still animals. And there's also ways, like you said, for that compassion to be framed so that we can say, you know, my survival depends on me coexisting with people who look like me, and therefore my compassion should be confined to people who look like me. You know, now I'm just spitballing. But I agree with you 100%, and I hope that my like kind of distinction there makes sense. But I'll push this forward. So, you know, this whole panel really is with the goal of us going into the future and talking about where we go next from here. So I want to start off with a question to both of you, and we can start with Paimana here, but this kind of touches on a lot of everything that we've been discussing here today. The question is, do European citizens have a moral obligation to migrants, both living in camps and those attempting to enter Europe today? And if so, to what extent are they obligated to act in support of them? Let me give a quick disclaimer. My background is in philosophy, and I care so deeply about words. Obligation isn't perfect here. What we're really saying is do European citizens have a moral responsibility to care, to take an interest in the well-being of migrants? And if so, what should they do about it? Do they need to protest? Do they need to be active participants in policy changes by organizing? And we can start with Paimana.
That's a really good question, and I think it's very hard, obviously, for some people to answer that question. But yes, in essence, that every European citizen has an obligation, and the reason for that answer is because it's right at our front door. You know, if someone knocks on your door, let's look at this in the, like, I keep bringing back down to the human level rather than such a big policy level. The reason for this is because that's how we can answer this question. You know, if someone knocks on your door and asks you for help, you know, they're lost, they're hungry, they need help. Of course, you're going to try and do everything that you can to support them. And yes, we understand that there are people out there who try to manipulate and try to take advantage of such situations. But this comes back down to our moral obligation. Our moral obligation is to help those who are less fortunate than us. And that it relates to everyone in the population, because if you can't help someone, you know, who is less fortunate than you today, then tomorrow that could be you. You know, tomorrow that could be you at someone else's front door asking for help. And then for them to turn around and shut you out, then where are we getting to it as a human race? You know, I think that's what it comes down to, and the things that we could do and the actions that we can take as citizens are very, very easy and very, very simple. You know, because I understand that every citizen has their own very difficult situations in their life. Everyone's dealing with a current COVID-19 pandemic, going through such strains on their mental health, but also their economic abilities to try and help. One of the biggest things you could do is give your time to volunteer. Volunteering is the biggest way that you can help and support refugees across Europe. And that just means maybe an hour in a week or an hour in a month or 2 hours even, not even that much. Just going and helping a charity or a local voluntary organization carrying out food distribution or helping in some way. That could be the first step. In terms of actually physically giving your time. The second is obviously raising awareness of the issues, so speaking up and speaking out. I think that also creates conversations, not only with your family members and your friends, but in people in your wider community. So utilizing the fact that you have the internet at your fingertips and being able to bust some of these myths and saying this is incorrect, this is wrong. You know, we should be extending compassion to individuals who are coming onto our shores or coming into our communities. And that way that we start those conversations and try and bust some of this misinformation out there in regards to the dehumanization of refugees and migrants. And so these are two very simple things that we can do. And obviously, if you want to be more involved, you can do more organizing and getting politically involved and actually attending meetings and speaking up. But I think the biggest way for me personally, for people, is voting. So what we see is mostly individuals, especially, they say young people don't vote, but I don't agree with that. I think most people are quite passionate about voting. It's just taking the time on election day and going out there and voting for the individual or the party that stands up for refugees, that has the morally right argument. Because if you don't vote, then you can't complain about why a far-right party has got into power or why a right-wing government is in power. And so I think voting is the biggest way, and it's so simple, you know, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of your time at a polling station, ticking a box, and literally that is it. And so if that's the only thing you can do, that's the only thing you should do, which is voting, and voting for the right people to get into public office so that they can push policies that are actually humanizing refugees and helping refugees in communities across Europe.
Awesome. So I heard, just to make sure that I got you good, European citizens have a responsibility or obligation. I'll get back to you guys on what's perfect here, but a responsibility or an obligation to take an interest in the well-being of migrants to the extent that, to whatever extent they can, to humanize migrants. Most importantly, it's to play an active role in the political process that impacts their futures. And then thereafter volunteering, and thereafter speaking out. Yeah, is that right?
Yes, I hope that was, you know, a good answer that people can actually go away and actually act on. You know, we try to break these down and make them simple so that people don't feel overwhelmed. Like it's not, they're not trying to change government policy. You know, that's a huge, big thing for you to do. So just take it small. You know, you want to do something little. And even if it's about donating to voluntary organizations, then do that, you know.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Matthias, same question for you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, it's I think Peymana gave an excellent summary of what European citizens can do, and that even the smallest of actions, like just giving a couple of hours a week to charity can make a huge difference. And as I said before, I see volunteering as a form of civil disobedience. It's really going against the policies of governments that are aimed at making the lives of refugees and immigrants as difficult and as hard as possible. And charities stepping in and volunteers stepping in to mitigate those effects and to help people. Yeah, I think this is really, really important. So maybe I'm just going to hone in on the responsibility or obligation part. I think, yeah, maybe obligation is a strong word, and I think a lot of people might disagree with this. But I think, yeah, there's definitely, I think every citizen has a responsibility, to trying to make the society that they're part of better. And I think solidarity with refugees and migrants is part of a broader picture here. I think what we've seen in European society, but also globally, is yeah, I think the right word. Well, society has become harder and colder and less inclusive, and growing wealth inequalities, and people who are at the bottom are blamed for being at the bottom, and while they're locked out of opportunities. And I think there's a German or a movement that is very successful now in Germany, which is called Leave No One Behind. The idea that is also campaigning very much for refugee rights. It's a sense of, we really need societies that provide opportunities that are more inclusive, not just for refugees, but for everybody, also for homeless people, for people who are chronically ill, I mean, the list is endless of people who are vulnerable, people who need help, people who need more compassion. And I think, yeah, just to go back to the responsibility, I think every European citizen has a responsibility to this, to make our societies work better for everyone. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. I have one more question for you regarding sort of the elections and what we need to, especially as our audience in America, like what should we be paying attention to? But before I move on to that, I was wanting to ask you to elaborate on how volunteering is a form of civil disobedience. I think I understand you, but I would love to hear sort of like, you know.
So the policy of the European Union here, here in Greece, the way we experience it here on the ground, and as I mean volunteers and refugees, is one of that's aimed at deterring people, make things as horrible as possible, so you scare people away, so people who are in the camps send a text message to their relatives back home and say, please don't come because it's horrible. If people do arrive, the focus is on containing people, keeping them trapped on islands, keeping them trapped in camps. And then the next step is deportation, send them back. And by being here on the ground, by volunteering, we make the situation relatively less horrible. We provide opportunities for education, we provide psychosocial care. It's never enough. It's never enough. The situation is so horrible that all grassroots NGOs that are active here are constantly working at full capacity, and still the needs are immense and cannot be met. But at least they mitigate some of the worst effects of the policies. And we also play an important part, volunteers here on the ground play an important part in monitoring, in picking up human rights violations, in documenting human rights violations, alerting experts and policymakers to what is happening here. And I think this plays a really important part in the role of volunteers, and volunteering being a form of civil disobedience. It really, I think it allows you to become very familiar with the context, with the reality on the ground, that is not influenced by media, that is not influenced by rhetoric of politicians, but what you just see with your own eyes. And this is a very powerful tool. This is something that you can use to convince other people. This is something that you can use to also approach politicians and policymakers, that you are speaking from the reality on the ground, and that whatever looks really great on a piece of paper in Brussels, in reality just doesn't work. I hope that gives you a better idea of why I see volunteering as a form of civil disobedience.
Definitely. It's almost like policy the policies that are created and the way that the EU is responding is incentivizing something. Their goal is not for people to keep migrating to the EU. It's almost like volunteers are saying, hey, this isn't right. We're going to make this better, one, by advocating and being allies to the people, the humans that are coming into our borders. But in my view, almost more importantly, we're going to be the eyes and ears. We're going to, in some sense, report and do some investigative journalism, but also allow for, and again, this is my bias, but I feel that as humans, we sometimes need that in order to empathize. We need to be able to see it for ourselves, hear it for ourselves, and then be able to recontextualize it to what makes sense in our head, So yeah, I think that's definitely helps tie it up there. All right, so like I said, elections are coming up in a number of EU member states. So how important are those elections to the future for migrants in the EU? And is there any specific election or number of elections that are most important?
Is that a question to me or to Peimana?
It's for you, Matthias. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, I think very interesting that you asked this, because today is election day in the Netherlands, and I think this is very significant because the Netherlands is a very important player within the European Union, especially when it comes to fiscal policy. Dutch people are famous for knowing how to manage money very well. But there's also, and this is much more worrying, there's also quite a strong right-wing, far-right populist party. And yeah, maybe in this election day, they might gain some seats. Yeah, I'm not following up the results very closely, but there's a chance for them gaining some seats, and this might mean that a country that up until now has always been a very European player, has always been has had a strong focus on European solidarity. This might potentially change. That's really a worst case scenario. Because I think what Europe really needs now are countries and governments that are really committed to European solidarity. Because one of the reasons, in the beginning of this session, I talked about the political gridlock. It's one of the reasons why we still have this situation in the Greek islands today is because 27 European countries just can't get on the same page about what to do or how to approach this. And that's why we were left with an ad hoc, very awful policy. So maybe going beyond the Dutch election, there are many risks in the coming years of populist parties growing, becoming more influential. And for this, I'm mostly looking at France, which is quite worrying, where Marine Le Pen is still very influential, where Macron hasn't done a good job in actually presenting an alternative to the far right. So there are a lot of risks of European countries swinging to the right, being more nationalistic, less focused on European solidarity, and this would make a humane, a humane approach to asylum and migration even more difficult to reach. So yeah, there are concerns, but on the other hand, I just want to end with a positive note. That there are also on the left, there's a growing dynamic. The green parties are on the rise across Europe as well. So yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There's also a lot to be hopeful about as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it, but the world feels like a simulation, I'm telling you. The parallels with the US are so, I can't allow myself to talk about them, but they're there. Peimana, do you want to add anything to that before I pose the last question, which is actually for both of you?
Okay, I think I agree with much of Matthias's reflections on European elections. I think for me as a Brit, the biggest one of my concerns are France and Germany, just because Germany will see a new leader come and Angela Merkel leave, and so where we've had stable leadership in the EU from Angela Merkel in terms of being pro kind of refugees, and in a sense, we might see a shift in Germany because of that influx of 1 million refugees to Germany. For France, as Matthias mentioned, in terms of Marine Le Pen and Macron's election in France, and that move to the far right in such an extreme sense that they're now policing what women should be wearing and not wearing in France. And so those kinds of things are very concerning, just because they're so close to Britain, but also we'll feel the shift in terms of power at the top of these nations and how that impacts the rest of relationships across Europe. So those are the biggest concerns for me in terms of elections. We don't unfortunately hear much about these elections in Britain. They are not reported as much on television, but those of us who are politically interested will be following them with very much close interest. I think the biggest thing, one of the things that Matthias mentioned actually relates to this, is diversity and inclusion, not just politically, but in the media as well. So if you have a diverse and inclusive media that encompasses all of society, then you'll have different types of reporting, not only on elections, but on populations and refugee issues and various other topics.
You guys are teaching me a lot. I'm just jotting notes down that are not even for you guys, but they're for my own personal. So this has been extremely educational for, I hope, everybody in the audience, but definitely for me. So before I pose the last question, I just want to thank you both so much for your time. This has been awesome. Again, both for viewers, but particularly for me. So last question here for both of you, and why don't we just go ahead and start off with Paimana. Okay, so through our campaign, we've emphasized how important it is to listen to refugee voices. So not just what the BBC is saying about the crisis, but what migrants are experiencing and what they want said about those experiences, their lived experiences. So yeah, including those who are still confined in camps today and are still fighting to be seen and have their voices heard in the media landscape that does not often pass them the mic. In your work, how do you prioritize migrant stories and empower their voices?
So we do several things in terms of making sure that we have refugee voices active in our policies. Obviously, one, we do listening events. So we hold listening roundtables and events with communities that are impacted by these issues. So one of the biggest I can give you an example that does not really relate to refugees or migrants as such, but impacts the community anyways. So one of the Conservatives' policies in regards to Muslims in the United Kingdom is on the Prevent programme, which demonizes and make sure that police forces across the UK use their intelligence and their force to gather intelligence about Muslim communities. And so one of the ways that the council in Harrow tried to counteract some of these issues that are impacting these communities is by bringing them to the table, inviting them to the council, having them around the table, actually physically sitting there to talk to us about their issues. And so not only do we do that for those kinds of communities already embedded, but we do that for migrant and refugee communities. So when we talk or work with voluntary sector organizations, we make sure that we have individuals from these charities who can bring in either volunteers from the refugee community or people impacted to talk about their lived experiences. And so when we form actual reports that influence our policies and the way that we interact, we make sure we have case study examples of actual lived experiences of individuals, people who have come through the system trying to access local government services, specifically because it relates to my job as a local politician, and how we can better that system that impacts them. So I think listening through roundtables and actually having them present in the room is one way. And the second is obviously making sure that their voices are included in actual reports and written up in policy papers that go to politicians and policymakers, so that we can actually have those experiences in front of us and actually have the data there to talk about those experiences. I think it's really difficult to bring in these voices, so that is a barrier in trying to be inclusive and give them that platform. But I think the biggest thing is social media. And the internet is the biggest way that you can raise a platform for any community. And so what you guys are doing with Full Potential, Afghan Empowered, all of these other different organizations on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, is lifting up the voices of people who wouldn't necessarily be heard by mainstream media or who are not invited. And so having these kinds of discussions and these panels also busts those myths and give them a platform to speak out. And so thank you very much for doing this. It's very, very helpful, not only for us, I'm sure Matthias agrees, for us and having these conversations, but for people watching this and having those voices actually being heard on social media loud and clear. Because once you get someone to share it, you know, and the networks that see that kind of content, that also increases awareness of the issues.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I did not know that there was any sort of system, frankly, anywhere in politics where we had asylum seekers or migrants sitting at the same table as policymakers. So that is awesome. And I don't think the average is aware of any of that. So thank you for sharing. And Matthias, so your turn. Same question. Would you like me to repeat it?
No, I still remember the question. Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Peymana said. How important the work is that you guys are doing of amplifying refugee voices, because this is really essential. The more people hear about the experiences of refugees, the more people will also understand, and again brings me back to the concept of compassion. The more people will also be able to feel compassion with refugees and understand what refugees are going through and also what drives them. And to talk about my context, here the Greek islands, there are immense barriers to amplifying the voices of refugees. People here in the camps, they are in a very vulnerable position. They are really subjected to the system, an arbitrary asylum system. They have to be very careful with speaking publicly. And they also, it's also just very difficult to reach people, because NGOs aren't always allowed to go into the camps, especially now with COVID. It's very difficult to reach people, and internet connection in the camps is non-existent or very spotty. So it's very difficult to reach people and get their voices and actually amplify their voices. But we try, and there are many different projects. For example, on Lesbos, there's an amazing project that has been running for years now. It's called Refugee Focus. It's called Refocus Media Labs. And they actually provide media trainings to people living in the camps, helping them how to learn how to do a video interview, how to do photography, edit pictures, the basics of journalism. And a lot of the reporting recently that is coming out of Lesbos is being done by their students, which is really amazing, and they do it very professionally. And there are many other initiatives like this that really upskill or give people in the camp the tools to raise their voices. And these initiatives are incredibly important. And yeah, maybe one more thing to add is also my personal experience. Working here on HEOS, several of my colleagues are also themselves refugees, and it's just it's just so much that you can learn from them. There's so many things that you don't see if you haven't been through the experience yourself. It really helps if yeah, you can just listen to someone who is a refugee or has a refugee background, and can share their experience. It's very important to listen to those voices.
Thank you so much. Last week we had a panel with two women who are both, one used to live in the camps and one currently was living in a camp during our panel. And that was sort of my first time really understanding the nuances, you could say. Like, I've read several articles and even ones written by refugees themselves or people who'd formerly lived in camps, but it was my first time really hearing like, hey, we have trouble speaking about our experiences. We can't speak about our experiences. And not just that, we want to. So just understanding that, yeah, we have I feel a responsibility to center those voices and to be, if we care to help, how are we going to help without understanding the problem? And how are we going to understand the problem without going to the source? Not, the people who are perpetuating it, but the ones who are being impacted by it. So yeah, it's awesome. Both of you are incredible. It's been an absolute honor to speak with you and to share your experiences with our audience. Thank you so much. And with that, that was my last question. Do either of you have anything else that you want to throw in there before we're done?
No, just thank you for having us and hosting us and having this conversation. I think it's really important.
I think so too.
Yeah, I think I can also just echo that. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here, and yeah, I really hope in the future to see more of your work as well, and you guys carry on amplifying refugee voices.